Hello and welcome. I am super happy to be able to welcome everyone who's tuned in here to this fabulous event that has been organized with the help of Ugly Duckling Press and the Kelly Writers House at the University of Pennsylvania, devoted to a number of recent translations of very important work of the late 20th century by the Moscow Conceptualists, poets, artists, and performance artists. We're going to hear from a number of translators who are going to be reading their new translations tonight. And we're also going to have a chance to have a roundtable discussion of Moscow Conceptualism and of translating it. We hope that everyone who's tuned in on the YouTube channel is planning to stick around for the entire event and to post questions in the YouTube chat, which we will be able to feed back into our panelists and translators later on when we get to a Q&A period. But for a start, I'm going to introduce Matvei Yankelevich, who is going to tell us a little bit about Moscow Conceptualism and perhaps contextualize a little bit what has suddenly brought Moscow Conceptualist writing to us in the United States. Matvei is himself a poet and a translator. He's received prizes himself for his translations of the Abiriyu poets, a somewhat earlier group of nonconformist Russian poets. He is one of the founding editors of Ugly Duckling Press, located in New York, and also the press which brought out all of these recent wonderful translations as part of its Eastern European Poets series, of which he is the lead editor. So Matvei, thank you so much, both for co-sponsoring this event, for organizing all these great translations. And I'll let you take it away with some words about Moscow Conceptualism.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you everyone at Kelly Writers House. It's a privilege to present this work here. We've had some opportunities to gather these translators and their work in the past, but not for a long time now. So it's great to have everybody here. I don't want to prescribe too much context or for this event, except to say that we're dealing with here mostly writing from the 70s to the 90s, so both in some cases post-Soviet as well, in Prigov's case. But we are really dealing with a group of writers who were part of a community of artists, writers, thinkers that really coalesced in the 70s and who worked together in many different ways. Both Dmitri Alexandrovich Prigov and Lev Rubinstein participated in events that Andrei Monastyrski put together under the rubric of collective actions in Moscow in the late 70s, early 80s. All of them were variously, well, especially Prigov and Monastyrski moved between writing and art, visual art or conceptual art, poetry in that scene seems to have been considered a kind of conceptual practice that was akin to and very kind of much part of the fabric of conceptual practice or conceptual art practice. So what we're going to be hearing is, I think, as Lev Rubinstein would say, not necessarily poetry, but texts. And I think in some way that attitude of Rubinstein's toward his own production as a writer of library card poems or stacks of cards rather than books, rather than poems. I think that attitude said something about what their project really was. It was a much, was not only aesthetic and not necessarily rooted in the same traditions that Russian poetry is traditionally considered to be rooted in. And that means that lyric persona and so forth are very different in these works than they would have been for the dominant Soviet Russian language poetic production of that time. So these were people who were outsiders in a sense, not people call this group or the larger framework as nonconformist in the Soviet period sometimes, but they were also insiders in a smaller alternative community that coalesced around conceptual practices, or that might be even a kind of word that doesn't quite work, and we'll think about, I hope, whether that framework really works in the Russian context or the Soviet context, it being so different from the Western context, which they were aware of, but certainly transformed to their own purposes and contexts. I sometimes like to call it contextualism. But one thing that I hope we will be able to talk about in the Q&A is a shared interest of all of these writers, artists, in materiality. And I'm thinking particularly of the materiality of the text, and I'm thinking of Andrei Monastyrski's artist books, which are basically most of the body of the book Elementary Poetry, which we put out, which Yelena, Kalinsky, and Brian Droitcour translated and introduced. And that book has artist books of Monastyrski's, or book objects, poetry objects of Monastyrski's that include things like sandpaper and material objects as poems, documentation of various kinds that pasted in pictures from other books and diagrams and all kinds of fascinating material work. But Lev Rubinstein is well known also for specifically these library card poems. He worked at a library, maybe that's where he got the idea. He wrote most of the works that were translated by Philometris in the complete catalog of comedic novelties on cards and these decks. When I talked to Rubinstein about the decks of cards, he said, well, any other format is already a translation. So if it becomes, what was important to him was the object of the index cards or library cards themselves as an artwork, rather than simply that is more than just a container for the text, but actually is a guiding principle to its structure. And Prigov, of course, is well known as an artist, but I think it's also interesting to think about his books or his works in the context of samizdat, materiality. And I wanted to show you a little bit of, unfortunately, it's falling apart. That's what happens. This is a 1992 post-Soviet booklet written in the form that, by Prigov, in the same form he would have written his works in the 1980s and 70s. So this quarter of an A4 page is part of, and there were many of these, as you can imagine, since he wrote 20,000 poems or something. So
30,000.
30,000. Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't realize. So he went over his goal. This not only, I'm showing this little booklet, which just maybe thought of as like, well, for expediency or for hiding under a mattress, this was a good form. But his books or his booklets often play with the form itself, and not only with the sort of samizdat culture that it invokes, but also playing with the stapling all of the unsuccessful poems, for instance, all the way around so you can't open them, or using the form of the book to create opportunities for the reader to kind of flip back and forth, the works that run across the foredge of the book, and to variously, well, I won't go into too many of these examples, but it's certainly something that also preoccupied Prigov. So I wonder if we'll get to talk about the sort of materiality in relationship to these poets, how they conceived of their works in very specific physical forms, what it means to translate from those forms, and so forth. And I have another possibly related angle that I hope we'll get at, or we'll be able to think about when Yelena, Brian, Ainsley, Simon, and Phil present, and that is what connects these works to, or what is the, let's say, sentimental or framework of sentiment that connects these works. I've been really interested in the way that Prigov, with his domestic poems, or the pathos of the police officer figure, or Rubinstein with his family albums and all kinds of gathering of found language, and Monastyrski with his incredibly, I mean, I think, really kind of frightening sort of creation of worlds that are sort of almost solipsistic, and where he very much wonders about community and about, and there's, I guess it's a little hard to frame Monastyrski this way, but I think that it is possible. And that is that they're all kind of offering in the late Soviet period a way into some kind of authentic feeling, which is very strange to me, while they're being so super conceptual, a kind of real exploration of the possibility of whether poetry can actually create out of the detritus of Soviet, degraded Soviet life, create something that has, where pathos perhaps can be reclaimed, or sentiment can be finally torn away from its Soviet context and re-experienced in some more personal way through alternative communities, or through a kind of turning of the lyric on itself. Those are some thoughts to just sort of thinking that I think the material that we're going to hear is so incredibly rich in many ways, and hopefully maybe those are some things we could keep in the background and return to. So without further ado, I believe Kevin will be introducing our first pair of readers. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Matvei. That was awesome. And I think it brings to the fore certain of the specificities of the question of making sense of Moscow conceptualism from our temporally and spatially distant place. Where did this word come from, conceptualism, which seems so familiar to us in the West, and names actually an artistic movement or epoch in the West, and comes to be applied to these folks. But then the way that it doesn't really fit that well in certain of its, usual characteristics, in particular in the way that they were so invested in reviving sincerity already by the 1980s, which seems to us to be in some ways distant from what we would think of as conceptualist practice, ironic, distanced, and always interrogating the texts and other practices that it takes on. Anyway, so I am so happy to introduce our first pair of speakers, Simon Schichat and Ainsley Morse. Simon Schichat worked on US-Russian affairs at the State Department in Washington and in the US Embassy in Moscow for over 25 years. Well, actually, he has 25 years of service. I'm not sure if all of them were spent in those places. He is a poet, and his poetry can be found in several rare books, including Svelte, published by Richard Hell when Schichat was only 16, Blue Skies, Light and Shadow, All Shook Up, at Baoshan, as well as the anthologies None of the Above and Up Late, which was edited by Andrei Cadrescu. He's from Washington, D.C., and he attended the University of Chicago and published the journal Buffalo Stamps before he moved to New York in 1975 to become part of the St. Mark's downtown writing scene. Schichat was also active in small press publishing. He edited the 432 Review and founded Caveman. He has degrees in addition to his degree from Chicago, from Yale, Harvard, the Industrial College of the Armed Forces of the National Defense University. He taught at Fudan University in Shanghai. He led workshops at the Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church. In 2016, his translation of Chinese poet Hai Zi's lyric drama Regicide was published in Hong Kong. And he will be reading with Ainsley Morse. Ainsley Morse has been translating 20th and 21st century Russian and former Yugoslav literature since 2006. She teaches Russian language and literature at Dartmouth College. Previous Ugly Duckling Press publications with Ainsley's participation include the co-translation of Vsevolod Nekrasov's work with Bella Shaevich that came out in 2013. And I think that was the first time that I met Ainsley when she came through Philadelphia with that book. And Holin 66, Diaries and Poems, also with Shaevich, which came out in 2017. Other recent translations include the farcical Soviet pastoral Beyond Tula by Andrei Igunov, and a collection of theoretical essays by the brilliant formalist Yuri Tynyanov. Coming up is the macabre modernist prose of Konstantin Vaginov and a number of contemporary Russian women's poets. So I'll let you guys take it away with your translations of Dmitri Alexandrovich Prigov.
Okay, and first, thank you, Kevin, very much for putting this together and giving us this opportunity to get this work in front of or in the ears of people who haven't yet been exposed to it. So the first piece I'm going to read is one of the very first works of Prigov that I ever read and that I tried to translate because, as you'll see, for someone who was being trained to read Russian newspapers, it's the kind of language that I could easily apprehend. So, obituaries. It is with deep regret that the Central Committee of the CPSU, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, and the Soviet government report that on February 10th, January 29th, old style, of the year 1837, at the age of 38, as a result of a tragic duel, the life of the great Russian poet Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin was cut short. Comrade A.S. Pushkin was always distinguished by his upstanding principles, his sense of responsibility, and his conscientious attitude towards himself and those around him. In all the posts to which he was sent, he displayed selfless dedication to his duties, military bravery and heroism, and the noble qualities of patriot, citizen, and poet. He will remain always in the hearts of his friends and relatives who knew him as a playboy, joker, womanizer, and mischief maker. The name Pushkin will live forever in the memory of the people as the leading light of Russian poetry. It is with deep regret that the Central Committee of the CPSU, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, and the Soviet government report that on July 15th, 1841, the marvelous Russian poet Mikhail Yurievich Lermontov died as a result of a duel. Comrade M.Y. Lermontov was always distinguished by his upstanding principles, his sense of responsibility, and his conscientious attitude towards himself and those around him. In all the posts to which he was sent, he displayed selfless dedication to his duties, military bravery and heroism, and the noble qualities of patriot, citizen, and poet. He will remain forever in the hearts of his friends and relatives who knew him as a person of difficult and hot-tempered character, a dualist and visionary. The name Lermontov will live forever in the memory of the people as the dark genius of the era. It is with deep regret that the Central Committee of the CPSU, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, and the Soviet government report that in the year 1881, the famous writer Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky departed from life. Comrade F.M. Dostoevsky was always distinguished by his upstanding principles, his sense of responsibility, and his conscientious attitude towards himself and those around him. In all the posts to which he was sent, he displayed selfless dedication to duty, military bravery and heroism, and the noble qualities of patriot, citizen, and poet. He will always remain in the hearts of his friends and relatives who knew him as a peevish and suspicious person, burdened with serious illness and the memory of his years spent in prison. The name Dostoevsky will live forever in the memory of the people as a seeker of God and a fideist. It is with deep regret that the Central Committee of the CPSU, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, and the Soviet government report that Count Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy is no more. Comrade L.N. Tolstoy was always distinguished by his upstanding principles, his sense of responsibility, and his conscientious attitude towards himself and those around him. In all the posts to which he was sent, he displayed selfless dedication to his duties, military bravery and heroism, and the noble qualities of patriot, citizen, and poet. He will remain always in the hearts of his friends and relatives who knew him as a big aristocrat, fascinated by the ideas of Buddhism, Tolstoyanism, and living the simple life. The name Tolstoy will live forever in the memory of the people as a mirror of the Russian Revolution. It is with deep regret that the Central Committee of the CPSU, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, and the Soviet government report that in the year 1980, in the city of Moscow, in the 40th year of his life, Dmitri Alexandrovich Prigov continues to live. And now Ainsley and I are going to read something jointly since it's a dialogue.
We're going to do all three?
Why don't we do the first and the third?
All right. So this is the cycle called Apotheosis of the Officer. And this officer, this is Simon's translation of the famous Militsioner. This is one of Prigov's best known cycles from the mid-70s. And it begins with 3 advisory dialogues that are meant to really explain what's going on in the cycle. All right, why don't you be first, officer?
So what's this apotheosis?
How to explain? It's kind of like getting an honor.
An honor? Like getting epaulets?
Well, no, not quite epaulets.
Well, what then? Maybe a medal?
No, not quite like a medal.
Not really?
Not really.
So what is it then?
Well, apotheosis. It's kind of like a certificate of appreciation.
Aha, got it.
So we're skipping the second advisory dialogue and straight into the third.
Citizen author, what is this apotheosis?
How could I explain it to make it easier to understand? It's the highest point in this instance of life.
What? It's like the highest rank?
But for every highest rank, a higher one can be found.
So it's the very highest rank.
But the very highest rank can always be trumped by an act of the people's heroism and glory.
So what is it then?
It is triumph in the face of the limits of possibility.
How's that? How can you guess what will be impossible further down the line? That can only happen after death.
Yes, apotheosis is the triumph of life in the rays of ascending death. I'm now going to read a couple of poems from the cycle now that you have been advised. So this is the first poem in the cycle. When here he stands, the officer on duty, as far as Vnukovo, vast expanses open to him, the officer looks to the east and to the west, and behind them opens out the void, and the center where the officer stands. The view of him from everywhere is open. From everywhere the officer can be seen. From the east, the officer can be seen, and from the south, the officer can be seen, and the officer is visible from the sea, and the officer is visible from the sky, and from underground. Well, it's not like he's hiding. Sitting in the House of Writers bar, the officer is drinking beer, drinking in his customary way. He doesn't even see the writers, but they're all looking right at him. Around him's bright and empty space, and all their different kinds of art to him mean absolutely nothing. He is truly life embodied, appearing in the form of duty. Life is short, though art has beauty, and in a tussle, life always wins. The officer strides stern and tall, while on his walkie-talkie he exchanges communications, who knows with whom, most likely with God. And from the heavenly walkie-talkie comes a voice truly unearthly. Oh, you beautiful officer, be upstanding and forever young, like a flowering cypress. This is the last one I'm going to read from this cycle. This song was written just to say that life is beautiful and complicated. Among the half-abandoned skies, there flits a little chickadee, while in an unmowed Moscow ditch, a knife in his breast, the officer lies.
So the next work that we're going to read is also a dialogue. It's a post-Soviet work. And am I unmuted or muted?
No, we can hear you.
Okay, because there's things that pop up on the screen. Anyway, this piece is called On Emptiness, and it has an advisory note which goes, there are no direct, unambiguously correct answers to the question of emptiness. The only answers are evasive and skittering. But the method and direction of the skittering, like the space that curves around a black hole, is precisely what allows us to reason about emptiness more or less definitively.
Is emptiness male or female? Or
this question is answered yes.
Does emptiness begin with anything, or does anything end in emptiness?
This question is answered yes, or it is answered maybe, or a third answer, everything will work out.
Does emptiness have an appearance or use?
This question is answered very simply.
Is emptiness one or two?
This question is answered to whatever extent necessary.
Does emptiness think of itself in terms of emptiness or fullness?
This question should not always be answered.
Is emptiness generated by itself or by something else which can also generate something else?
This question should be answered evasively.
Does emptiness manifest in something else or only in emptiness?
This question is answered by giving 2 thumbs up.
Is emptiness visible, palpable, or only graspable speculatively?
This question is answered by joining 2 fingers in a circle.
Is it worth doing a favor for emptiness or borrowing anything from it?
This question is answered with a nod of the head.
Are you silent because you are emptiness or because you have nothing to say about emptiness?
This question is answered with charged silence.
Is everything in emptiness for the sake of emptiness, or is there something that exceeds it?
This question is answered through absence.
Can emptiness reveal only emptiness, or is it that through emptiness all is manifested, and does all that manifests through emptiness reveal emptiness, or its total redundance?
This question should be answered through emptiness. And so that's the conclusion of that work. And I'm going to now read another post-Soviet work called Verdicts. It has a advisory note, but I'm going to pass on that. And you'll take it as it comes. The bear, for negligent performance of duty, shall be sentenced to 2 years probation with a deduction of 50% of salary at his place of permanent employment. Who objects to what? No one and to nothing. The hare, for petty theft, shall be sentenced to administrative discipline at his place of permanent residence. Who objects to what? No one and to nothing. The dog, for hooliganism, shall be sentenced to 1 year of imprisonment, but having been given a good reference from his place of work, this shall be changed to 15 days in public service. Get it? You don't get it? You get it, all right. The cat, for the systematic violation of public order and antisocial behavior, shall be sentenced to exile at a distance of 100 kilometers, and no objections. What do you have to object to? The wolf, for large-scale embezzlement, shall be sentenced to 25 years, or no, to be shot would be better. No, it's still more fair to say 25 years with confiscation of property. You think that's harsh? No, not really. It can't be done any other way. The rat, for antisocial behavior and insulting accepted norms of the political system, shall be sentenced to 5 years of hard labor, followed by a 10-year suspension of civil rights. Too little? But our judicial system is not punitive. It's humanist and instructional. We aren't fascists, after all. The wild boar, for a disagreeable appearance, shall be sentenced to death by being eaten, and rightly so. Though what good will it do? What, like you do things differently? The bird, for treason, shall be sentenced to death and the confiscation of property, to teach others not to do it. The echidna, for an anti-human appearance and overall nastiness, shall be sentenced to be shot with subsequent rehabilitation, so that there will be some order after all, and high justice will triumph. The elephant, for its huge size, which is an assault on human honor and dignity, shall be crossed off the list of existing beings, and its ongoing existence shall be considered an anomaly and a phantom. For economic, moral, political, and behavioral crimes, the polecat, fox, squirrel, badger, chipmunk, vole, jay, lark, raven and crow, deer and badger, kangaroo and its joeys, whale and shark, pike, swan and crab, and all their ilk, shall be sentenced to various terms of punishment in various places, but with a strictly legal and individual approach to each case, so that no indiscriminate leveling and wholesale depersonalization take place. The cockroach shall simply be sentenced to be shot. This needs no explanation. The lion shall be sentenced to public humiliation and degradation, since it's clear that the king of animals, nature, and everything else is man. Rivers shall be sentenced to be redirected in all possible directions, as a result of which they shall run shallow and dry up, which is only fair. The sun shall be sentenced to exposure and public repentance, with consequent removal from the list of remembrance and glorification of anything beginning with the words "long live." So it must be. Decisions for all the remaining cases are being prepared, and the sentences will be announced as they are decided, within a reasonable period of time. None will be exempt. So that concludes this poem.
I'm going to read a couple poems from the housekeeping cycle. Matvei briefly mentioned it. This is from around the same time as the officer poems I was reading. So it's early Prigov. And these are some of the probably best known poems that a lot of people like to recite. It's almost urban folklore or something. So I'm going to read two poems about washing the dishes, which I decided to do because it gives maybe another view into Prigov's seriality that we've already been seeing in some of the other stuff that we've read. And in conclusion, I'm actually going to read a version of a poem that's in the book, but I retranslated it for this reading. So hope it goes off well. All right. I wrestle with domestic entropy as a source of energy divine. These forces, inglorious and blind, I overcome in quiet, unsung struggle. I'll wash the dishes 3 times a day, wash and scrub the floor all over. I'll build the meaning and structure of the world on this place that seems like it is empty. This poem has a title, Banal Rumination on the Topic of Freedom. Just when you've finished up the dishes, look, a whole new pile awaits. What kind of freedom is this? Just let me make it to old age. True, you could just not wash them. But then there's people coming by and saying, hey, the dishes are dirty. What kind of space for freedom here? I forgot to introduce this next poem is a great poem about standing in line for scarce goods in the Soviet period. I scored some chuck strips in the meat store today and packed them with care to stay safe on the way. Went out from the counter, not even discreet, just lugging a huge chunk of black market meat. There lurched out a filthy, decrepit old hag. The chunk was enormous, it could only be dragged. Well, it'd be one thing if she worked at the store. Okay, then it's fair, she can take a bit more. But she was just random, and plus she was ugly. While me, I'm a poet, the pride of Russia, that's me. I spent half the day standing here among strangers, but happiness lives with these fucking malingerers. And a final poem from the cycle. The one who runs will surely fall, as will the one who walks or flies, as will the one who sits or lies, the one who drinks, who loves, who eats, will choke upon the first meatball because he's running like for real. He walks and means it, really lies. He eats and drinks and loves in style, and that is what will make him die.
I take it that was the end of the, or do you have one more for us?
Sorry. Yes, that was it. That's
all right.
It.
No, good. It ended with a resounding ring, so I was pretty sure that I was interpreting it right. Although, after Simon read the part about the sentences, I thought that also could be something to turn it back to me.
I mean, that's the end of what I'm reading. Simon, are you?
If we've got a time thing, we can have that be the last bit that we.
If you have more, that's okay too. Although we have a couple other readers, and I don't know.
Yeah, no. That's.
There's a kind of resoundingness to ending.
Yeah, no. I'm good with that.
Yeah, although it does create a certain kind of morbidity of Prigov. This selection that you guys have here, but maybe that's right. There was a certain kind of an existential quality to all of Prigov, which comes through, yeah, it comes through extraordinarily clearly here.
Yeah, no, he's he does have a Russian soul. What are you going to do?
There's nothing you can do about that. That's a death sentence.
The pride of Russia. That's me.
Or maybe it's just it's a diagnosis with no prognosis. All right. Well, thank you. We're going to move on then to our next pair of readers, and that is Yelena Kalinsky and Brian Droitcour, who are going to read Andrei Monastyrski. Yelena Kalinsky is an art historian based in Lansing, Michigan. She earned her PhD from Rutgers in 2013, the State University of New Jersey, with a dissertation entitled Collective Actions, Moscow Conceptualism, Performance, and the Archive, 1976 through 1989. In 2012, she edited and translated a volume of audience recollections of early collective actions performance for Soberskov Press. Previously, she worked as an archivist and Dodge curatorial fellow at the Zimmerli Art Museum, where she curated the exhibition Performing the Archive, Collective Actions in the 1970s and 80s. Her writing has appeared in Art Margins, Russian Literature, Nova Galeria newspapers, and elsewhere. And I'm really excited to hear her read and talk about Moscow Conceptualism because we have a real expert on our hands here. The other reader for this Monastyrski segment is Brian Droitcour, who is a writer, translator, and curator. He received a PhD in comparative literature at New York University with a dissertation on Andrei Monastyrski. From 2002 to 2007, he lived in Moscow, where he covered exhibitions for the Moscow Times, contributed to the Russian art monthly Art Chronika, and edited the English language digest editions of Art Chronica. And he translated books for WAM Knigi, an art publisher. He has contributed essays and reviews to Artform, Art in America, Rhizome, The New Inquiry, and other publications. In 2012, he won the second prize in the Compass Poetry Translation Competition for his rendering of Marina Tsvetaeva's long poem, Upon a Red Steed. So another quite expert informant with regard to Monastyrski. And I'll let you guys take it away. We're so looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Kevin. And thank you, Matvei, for bringing us together. I just want to say that the elementary poetry book is published in collaboration with Soberskov in Chicago. And yeah, we have some, let's see, we have some audio visual. So I'm going to try to share that and see how that goes. Hope we can all see that. We are reading one long poem, one of these poem book objects that Matvei referred to in the beginning. This is elementary poetry number 1 from 1975. The first section is called Elements. Wheel, egg, kite, ladder. Brian, I think you're kind of quiet. Having trouble hearing. Oh, very good. Okay. Ball.
Balloon.
Pit.
Rowboat.
Lake. Hall. Tunnel.
Dream.
Hill.
Haystack. Pile of sand.
Flag.
Glass. Mirror. Graveyard.
Funerary objects. Chisel. Bile. Tile. Pasture. Winter. Summer.
Sky. Rope.
Voice. Horizon. Pole. Stick. Board. Shore.
Terrace.
Attic. Balcony. Window. Field. Whirlpool. Pond. Saw. Soap. Glade. Glass. Mirror. Face.
Introductory sonnery. Talk toppa talk. Trock traprock. Talk toppa talk. Trock traprock. Talk toppa talk. Trock traprock. Talkie toppa talkie. Trocky traprocky. Talkie toppa talkie. Trocky traprocky. Talkie toppa talkie. Trocky traprocky. Trock talk. Toppa traprock. Trock talk. Toppa traprock. Talk talk. Toppa traprock. Tapak tapak trapak trapak tapak tapak trapak trapak tapak tapak trapak trapak. Trock 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 plot 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 trock 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 plot 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 trock 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 plot plot plot. Wheel.
Hill.
Rope.
The hill.
Between the wheel and the rope.
The hill.
Between the wheel and the rope.
The hill.
Between the wheel and the rope.
What is?
Between the wheel and the rope.
What is?
Between the wheel and the rope.
What is?
Between the wheel and the rope.
Summer.
Between the wheel and the rope.
Summer.
Between the wheel and the rope.
Summer.
Between the wheel and the rope.
Winter.
Between the wheel and the rope.
Winter.
Between the wheel and the rope.
Winter.
Between the wheel and the rope.
Everything.
Between the wheel and the rope.
Everything.
Between the wheel and the rope.
Everything.
Between the wheel and the rope.
And you.
Between the wheel and the rope.
And you.
Between the wheel and the rope.
And you.
Between the wheel and the rope.
And I.
Between the wheel and the rope.
and I,
between the wheel and the rope,
and I,
between the wheel and the rope,
up on the hill,
between the wheel and the rope,
up on the hill,
between the wheel and the rope,
up on the hill,
between the wheel and the rope,
wheel,
hit,
rope.
along the rope,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
along the rope,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
along the rope,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
the whole time,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
the whole time,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
the whole time.
The wheel rolls into the pit.
Look,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
look,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
look,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
it's ours,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
it's ours,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
it's ours.
The wheel rolls into the pit.
Down the hill,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
down the hill,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
down the hill,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
down it goes,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
down it goes,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
down it goes.
The wheel rolls into the pit.
There it goes,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
there it goes,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
there it goes.
The wheel rolls into the pit.
This is how,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
this is how,
The wheel rolls into the pit.
this is how.
The wheel rolls into the pit.
Road,
Pit.
wheel,
Rope.
rope, wheel,
Hill. Road.
road,
Wheel. Rope.
voice, wheel,
Rope.
zilly,
Zing, zing. Zing, zilly, cling, zing, 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 zilly, cling, zing, 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 zilly, cling, zing, zing. Zingy, zingy, zilly, cling, zing, zing, zingy, zingy, zilly, cling, zing, zing, zingy, zingy, zilly, cling, zing, zing. Zing, zilly, cling, zing, 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 zilly, cling, zing, 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 zilly, cling, zing, zing. Zilly clink, zilly cling, zing, zing, zilly clink, zilly cling, zing, zing, zilly clink, zilly cling, zing, zing. Zin, 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 zilly cling, zing, zing, zin, 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 zilly cling, zing, 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 zin, 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 zilly cling, zing, zing. Zink, 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 zilly clink, zink, 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 zilly clink, zink, 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 zilly clink, zink, zink.
voice,
Hill,
window,
pit,
wheel,
rope,
road, voice,
hill,
blade,
pit,
wheel,
rope,
road, voice,
hill, pit,
wheel,
rope,
road, voice,
hill,
glass,
pit,
wheel,
rope,
road, voice,
hill,
mirror,
pit,
wheel,
rope,
road, voice,
hill,
base,
pit,
wheel,
neck, rope,
road,
dreams,
a dream about a ladder, voice,
ladder,
road,
pit, road,
terrace window,
hill,
wheel,
a dream about a ladder. A dream about a flag,
voice,
50 meters,
glass,
road,
ladder,
flag,
window,
rope,
100 degrees,
wheel, pit,
hill,
egg,
egg,
door to
door.
the terrace. A dream about a kite,
wheel,
road, window,
hill,
graveyard, pond,
pond,
ladder, kite,
kite, terrace corner,
voice,
tunnel,
pit,
rope,
balloon, sky,
haystack,
rope,
kite,
window, horizon,
egg.
field,
September 26th, Thursday, stilts,
voice,
whirlpool,
hill,
ladder,
creek,
road,
railroad,
wheel. A dream about Osip the joiner. Door,
flag, glass,
ladder,
50 degrees,
burial supplies.
winter,
The window into Osip the joiner's studio.
pole, knife,
Sky,
shore,
height, chisel, attic,
voice,
balcony,
roof,
joiner's workshop,
mountain,
vial,
the river Strela,
egg,
wheel,
terrace,
hall,
garden, road, a sand pile,
lake,
saw,
stick,
rope, soap,
ball, rowboat, north,
summer,
pasture. That is it.
That was so wonderful. And the visuals are so amazing, the way that they build towards this incredible climax of diagrammatic complexity. I'm wondering if I can, introduce just a question here before we move on, which is a very immediate question about this particular text and performance, or artwork, I guess, and performance. So if I can pull up the chat here, I'll just read, first of all, Lainey Brown's question from the YouTube feed. Hypnotic. When we get to questions, I'm curious where the spoken text is in relation to the visual for the wheel, pit, rope piece, et cetera, onward and onward. Really, I think the question is intended to, right. And the other question, which was in the chat, was show us the script, because they're interested in how it lays out visually. And then, you guys are the art historians here. To what degree do you feel like your performance is grasping hold of a performance practice? I know that Monastyrski did a lot of happenings and gatherings in his apartment where he pulled people together to work with these texts and things. So is this performance that you've created for us here in some way a recreation of practices around these texts that you've somehow archaeologically pulled out? So anyway, I'll stop there. You don't have to go on for too long here because we have more Q&A and discussion at the end, but I think people are very curious about this piece.
This is entirely our interpretation of this book. So what you see on the screen is what is in the book, which was a very small edition. He only made a couple of these typewriter versions of this book. We've translated the words and we've decided how to perform them, but in fact, this poem was never performed. It would have been handled. Somebody would have seen it in Monastyrski's apartment, and it may have been passed around. People turn the pages. They perform it in their minds. So we've sort of manifested it in 3 dimensions. And I should say that the image at the end there, that painting, is also not part of the book. This is an insertion that we've chosen to make. It was a painting by Nikita Alexeyev, who is a collaborator of Monastyrski. He was a co-founder of Collective Actions, and Monastyrski asked him to paint a version of the dream of Osip the joiner, the last page of elementary poetry #1. So we've included it here in the PowerPoint as a surprise.
And I'll also add that Monastyrski, in the sort of late 60s, he was active in poetry readings. He was known for a very dramatic way of declaiming poetry, but the works in elementary poetry come from the period following that, when he was doing more experimental work, making things solely to be read. But I think when we decided to interpret it, we were thinking about how might Monastyrski have read it if he were interested in performance at the time when he wrote it.
So it's a mashup of Monastyrskis.
Yes.
In a sense. That's great. Thank you. And I'm sure that's going to feed into our questions at the conclusion of the reading as well. What a great performance. Thank you. So our next and final reader is going to be Philip Metres, who's the author of 10 books, including Instance, which came out with Ugly Duckling Press, Shrapnel Maps, forthcoming, the essay collection The Sound of Listening, the poetry books Sand Opera, and Pictures at an Exhibition, and a translated collection of Arseny Tarkovsky's poetry, I Burned at the Feast. I'll just mention here that I stepped into this event directly from my Tarkovsky class, where I assigned those translations. We haven't quite gotten to them yet. They come up a little bit later in the semester. So I'm really happy to welcome Philip Metres here. His work has garnered a Lannan Fellowship, 2 NEAs, 6 Ohio Arts Council grants, and more. He's professor of English and director of the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights program at John Carroll University. So take it away, Philip. Philip is going to read from his translations of Lev Rubinstein.
Thanks, Kevin. And one of the things I just said at the outset was, when I started becoming passionately fascinated by contemporary Russian poetry and conceptualist poetry, if I had known that, I don't know, almost 30 years later, that all these books would be translated and shared in English, that I would have thought that a good thing had been done, and I do feel that way today. So in order to present or represent Rubinstein's work, which were written on sort of library index cards, this is actually a Ugly Duckling Press joint of 35 new pages. I'm going to read this, but the first thing I want to do is called Farther and Farther On, so dashi dashi, and I'm going to do it as a PowerPoint because what the hell, why not? Every version, is itself a new, and oh shoot, of course, it would be nice if I know how to use PowerPoint. It's been a little while. From the beginning. Here, everything begins. Everything begins here. However, let's go farther. Here, no one will ask you who you are and where you're from. Everything is clear as is. This is the place where you're spared persistent cross-examination. But let's go farther. Here, the atmosphere is congenial and free. Here's where you can really relax. But we should go further. Here, whatever your eyes see is delightful. Whatever your ears hear is sweet melody. Whatever is said is truth. But let's go farther. Here, everything is entirely different. It's not important how. What's important is that it's different. Here, nothing matters. I only wish I could remember this forever. Here, the sharpest bout of nostalgia grips you. How it comes about is unknown. Here, one shouldn't stay for too long. Later, it will probably become clear why. Here, each has their own bottom and ceiling. Each has their own borders of falling and soaring, and not just here. Here, all reminds you of something, points to something, refers to something. But as soon as you start to understand what's what, it's time to leave. Here, it's necessary to cope with the temptation to ask what will be farther on. But farther on, what's meant to be will be. Here it's written, passerby, stop, think. The next inscription reads, passerby, stop, try to think of something better than that. Here we read, passerby, sooner or later, well, you understand. So then, you understand? Here it's written, passerby, consider this. You might end up understanding nothing at all. Here, passerby, we never even knew each other. What should we talk about? Passerby, don't stop, go farther. Let's go farther. Here, someone in the half darkness decides to part with hope and cannot. Someone finding himself in financial difficulty looks for a way out and cannot find one. Someone tries to draw a distinct line between what is past and what is to come. He just isn't noticed. Someone arranged it in such a way that everything he says fits the situation. People like this. He is noticed. Here, someone over attentive doesn't notice the most important thing. Concentrating on tiny details, he looks a little silly. Someone striving for eternity slips and falls. A bright light falls on him. It's quite a pitiful sight. Someone is unable to come to his senses from some dumbfounding news, so he just goes on living, stunned. Someone loses himself in the crowd. They discover him, greet him noisily, almost by force drag him out to the middle, and there he stands. Here, someone with a frozen glance goes on, saying something more than inarticulate, then leaves, comes back, leaves again, and so on many times. Someone with inveterate habits helps a lady into a train car and waves after her for a long time. His face shows affection. Someone remains alone. He's totally confused. He has absolutely no idea what to do. His face shows the whole gamut of emotions. Someone, doubting, wants very much to ask something, but can't bring himself to it. An embarrassed smile. Here, someone in a quiet voice offers words of consolation. Someone, inconsolable, does not accept the words of consolation. He says he doesn't want anything from anyone. Someone, burdened by the need to impart to someone something extremely unpleasant, delays his decision. It's easy to understand him. Someone, considering it improper to get mixed up in others' affairs, constantly gets himself mixed up in them without as much as noticing. Here, someone, caught on the fishing rod of existence, cries about his fate and doesn't suspect anything. Someone in a half-stifled voice talks about how happy he is. Everyone exchanges secret glances. Someone begins talking about the distant past. It's useless to interrupt him. Someone unsuccessfully tries to explain something to someone. Lack of understanding makes him crazy. Here, someone is depressed with what's happening. An attempt to find out what exactly depresses him leads to nothing. One feels sorry for him. Someone consoles himself by waiting for something different. His path is despondent. Does he know this? Someone doesn't see or hear his very self. He really should. He would begin to look at many things very differently. Here, someone is unable to resist inertia. This does not bode well. Someone is absolutely unable to control himself. That won't do at all. Someone refuses to notice the obvious. He's probably doomed. Someone looks straight before him. His eyes are frozen in terror. He's not likely to be saved. Someone is strolling God knows where. You can still make him out. There he is. Here, someone is trying to save himself without any help. He'll never make it. Someone is trying as best he can to appear an outsider, but he won't escape either. Someone is focusing on the present with all his might, but he too will have to face the future. Someone's on the threshold of a final decision. Let's wait and see what will happen. Here, someone literally withers without constant encouragement. Well, let's support him. Someone thinks it's inconceivable that all of this will end sometime. Lord, give him strength. Someone said something and waits for what will be further. But what could be further? Let's go farther. Here it said, all those craving and lusting, those fighting in vain, and those scrambling out of the filth, those half-deaf and those forever hoarse. Well, what are we to do with them? Here it said, all those striving higher, those sliding into the abyss, those climbing on and out, those hurting and those living through uncontrollable passions, those accustomed to everything, those interesting in their own way. What do they want here? Why should they be here? Here it said, all those guilty without sin, those burned and blowing, those intently pondering, and those attracted by a barely audible voice of eternity, those stooped from the back-breaking puzzles of existence, those in an undue agitation from God knows what news, those anxiously listening to what is said. Where do they find themselves heading? Here it said, all those not guilty, but confessing, those seemingly cheered up, but every other minute falling into depression, those striving to beat their neighbor and grasping what's going on, but not understanding a thing, those dragging the baggage of their own hopes, and those affirming that everything is lost, that all those now too late and now too early, those swaying in the weak breeze and those stubborn in their own delusions, those thinking that everything is past, and those shifting from leg to leg, waiting for changes, that's enough already, it's time to stop. An entirely different voice. After that, he was a different person. He would just walk around quiet and graceful, smiling at something. Another voice. Well, that's it. Now it'll begin. Just be quiet. Don't get mixed up in this. Another voice. Well, just imagine with that smile of his, he just walked through all those circles. He's a very unique human being. I've never seen anyone like him in my entire life. Another voice. By the way, he also can't stand her. So you really shouldn't. Another voice. You're not bothering me at all, I assure you. Just let me just put a full stop here. Another voice. The modest tread of clouds is obtuse. What's after this? Can you remember? Yes, it was so long ago. Another voice. Take a close look sometime at his usual facial expressions, at those forced grins. Look at those pitiful words. Listen to those pitiful words. Perhaps you'll understand then what I went through all those years. Another voice. Here comes the most difficult part. Hold on, Professor. There. You didn't hurt yourself? Well, thank God. Well, then I'll continue. That very summer has been accursedly hot, dusty, drought-ridden. In a word, a hellish summer. Not a summer, but a simmer, forgive the pun. So, and I've managed to hurt myself now. Another voice. Listen, your satanic fantasies just give me the creeps. To listen to you, one would think that there's no reason to live. Another voice. If you want, you can accompany me. Well, at least as far as the station. I trust you're something of a gentleman. Another voice. To start with, just look at yourself. Hey, you really look like hell. Another voice. Listen up. First, you're not going anywhere. You'll take your coat off and return to the table. Second, don't let me catch any of those so-called yearnings in your face. Third, anyone who dares in your presence to even slightly hint, well, you know, will have to deal with me. You're all right with that, I hope. Well, go ahead and take your coat off. Don't be naughty, old man. Another voice. So where can I go now? I've been kicked out everywhere. I've been nagged everywhere. Should I hang myself? Another voice. So what now? What can I do? There's no way back. It's clear. Stay where I am? Well, no, that's not for me. Should I go and face my fate? Okay, then I'm ready. And why are you silent? Why aren't you stopping me or consoling me? Surely one human word can sometimes save you from ruin. But what am I talking about? Whom am I speaking to? Farewell. Scene. The dacha at night. The trains sound their horns, husky in the distance. It's very cold. Another scene. The height of summer. Offstage, the songs of village girls. Another scene. A table set for tea, samovar, ring-shaped rolls. On the back of armchairs, quilts and coats carelessly tossed. A general air of lightheartedness. Another scene. Dining room in a modest house. Through heavy blinds, a modest light. Faces in all shapes and sizes filled with flowers. The heroine rushes in, her palms pressed to her temples. Almost unconscious, she falls into the rocking chair, sobbing. Another scene, veranda, fragrant, with flowers of fruit trees, 2 swings. One swing slightly rocks. It's clear that someone just got off it. Off stage, voices, an agitated female one, a calming male one. No one has appeared on stage yet. Sounds of nearing thunder. It suddenly darkens. An entirely different scene. From the arrangement of the scene, it's clear that the weather since morning has been excellent, and yesterday's gusty wind has died away, carrying away the torn fragments of a continuously hopeless gloom. From the lighting of the scene, it's clear that the mood of the hero, whose steps are already audible behind stage, is pure, light, and a little sad, like in the best days of one's youth. It's clear by the sudden silence that maybe the most decisive moment in the hero's life is coming. However, the noise born in the bowels of absolute silence grows imperceptibly. It grows ever louder until it gradually becomes intolerable. Zanavés. All right. That is farther and farther on. And I think I might have time for one text that my daughter is going to read with me. It's called Here I Am. Come on over. This is Layla. Here I am. Now here I am. So here I am.
Where have you been? We've given up all hope.
So
here I am. I can't describe these feelings.
These emotions.
These feelings.
You look just great, so strong and fit. Looking at you now, I almost didn't
recognize you.
Now
here I am. Is anything as fine as this majestic?
What could be as majestic?
As this fine.
My headache's gone and I can breathe, and on the whole, I feel
much better.
So
here I am. There is no other earth.
This is the only
earth.
There is no other.
Well, now you're talking. Honestly, I was already thinking, if it's going to be like this, why bother to begin at all? Now here I am. Could I have even dreamed?
Not even in a dream.
Just yesterday.
Repeat 4 times.
So
here I am, hard to believe, and yet
incredible.
But true.
The logs are crackling in a dying fire.
So
now here I am. I will not tire you.
I will not bore you, my reader.
Specialist at the planning department of a research institute, 54 years old.
On her second marriage.
Has a grown son from her first marriage.
Fit and youthful.
Loves to sing, plays guitar just for fun.
Around 2:30, was returning to work after her lunch break.
So
taxi driver, 39 years old.
In his youth, he lifted weights, then gave it up.
Married.
2 children, Dennis 14 and Lada 9.
Around 2:30, took the car over from his partner and headed towards Domodedovo.
Now,
Teacher at a kindergarten, 24 years old.
height around 5'8" or 5'9".
Nice looking, slightly overweight.
Lives with her parents.
Single, but apparently has a steady boyfriend.
Around 2:30, was standing at the tram stop near the Riot train station.
So,
An actor at the drama theater, 51 years old.
3 years ago, he suffered a massive heart attack.
At the theater, he plays mainly supporting roles.
Around 2:30, left the theater after the rehearsal, decided to walk a couple of stops.
Now,
In a word, everything must be extremely light, almost transparent, hardly perceptible.
perhaps something like a rainbow.
As for a description of the house, begin with whatever you like,
Perhaps with the roof covered.
or maybe a tree,
Let's say an old white willow by the fence.
or something like when you think you're pretending to be asleep, but in fact, you really are sleeping.
Or as if someone invisible sneaks up from behind, lays his hands on your shoulders, and laughs with such a familiar laugh that you can't hold back your tears.
And obviously, that's the reason you feel a constant presentiment of some unknown catastrophe.
Obviously, that's the reason you instinctively resist any changes in your life.
I just can't go on sewing back your damned half belt every single day.
She throws his coat to the floor and suddenly begins to sob.
However, we see very well it isn't about the half belt at all.
Or imagine you've been waiting for this moment your whole life.
So now you are trembling inside as you open the cherished door.
In other words, it's something like a farewell forever twisted in a tight spiral.
Do you understand?
Now here I am.
Here I am. I will not tire you, my reader, by describing the hardships I
The
encountered
hardships I
on my
encountered
journey.
on my journey, and my accidental companions, some of whom were quite nice, come to think of it, and some of whom
I'd rather not remember, and that completely explainable agitation and impatience that would increase as you near the cherished goal. Many other things, and now the night visions grow vague, dissolving in the morning fog.
And a gang of screaming kids is rushing down the slope
Straight to the river, and the Rhine hills and castles and vineyards are flying by.
And now everything is becoming endlessly distant. A cracked cup, a dusty stuffed squirrel, a small
Crystal sphere,
and
crumpled sheets of paper, and there's no reason at all to hit the drum, which won't resound anyway because it's dead.
And now the logs are crackling in a drying fire.
The logs are crackling in a dying fire. The flow of things will never stop.
We go our
We
separate
go our
ways.
separate ways. Do not forget
We
me.
go our separate ways. Do not
We
forget
go our
me.
separate ways. Do not forget me.
We go our separate ways. Do not forget me.
Thank you.
I'll be the lone clapper. I'm so glad that that was last. You're done, right, Phil? So I think we should bring all the faces to the screen. We're going to have just a little question and answer here. I'll throw out my plans for question and answer entirely, although maybe I'm just modifying them. My original plan, I was going to ask about the significance of Moscow Conceptualism now. What makes it significant? Why did we just translate all of this material? Why are people interested in reading it now? And what makes it relevant in the present? But I'll modify my question a little bit and say that I also have teenage daughters who like Moscow Conceptualist writing, and I've given these translations to them and they find them wonderful. So I'm interested, what is it, I'll rephrase, what is it about this poetry that connects with people who are 16 to 22 now? Because I find that it really does connect, and I'm sure that all of you have noticed that too in teaching this material. What is it about Moscow Conceptualism which suddenly seems so incredibly contemporary? I don't know who wants to go first with an answer to that.
I'll say a couple things just because I'm gonna have to leave pretty soon. We talked a little bit about this at the Prigov reading we did like 2 weeks ago, I think. I think there's kind of two answers to it. There's the question of what people are liking, right? So, because I also have taught this to college students. I've taught Prigov. I've also given Monastyrski. I think people like them in different ways. I think that, the Prigov thing, one really instructive example I have is that one of the assignments in the class that I recently taught him in was for the students to choose a poet that we had read and write something in the style of the poet. and Prigov was a big favorite among the students. And I think that there's this idea that it's like a shablon, right? Like there are and this is common to maybe some of the other Moscow conceptualists, but it's the idea of a little machine that gets built, and then you can like stick in whatever material you want and it'll spit out variations, right? And so, for instance, I had a student who really liked the Militsioner, the officer poems, and he's from Pakistan, and he wrote a really brilliant version using he called it Polis, spelled P-O-L-I-S, and he also worked in somehow the famous, I think it's the Sufi Romeo and Juliet story, the Medjun, and oh God, is it Lila? Like your daughter? Yeah. Anyway, and so I just think that there's something about the idea of building a working model that can work in lots of different contexts, right? But then the flip side of that is what we talked about at the Prigov reading we had a few weeks ago, is the way in which it's really specific, in which these practices are very specific to their time and place. And we talked about how there have been some kind of neo-Prigovian poetics observed in the past 10 or 15 years in contemporary poetry, but how it doesn't really work. And the closed, very coherent nature of Soviet society created someone like Prigov. And so on one level, his poetics only really works in that kind of a context. And a more open, heterogeneous society of the sort that, despite, repressive government and stuff, does exist in Russia right now, can't really do what someone like Prigov is doing in that work.
Thank you, Ainsley. That's a lot of food for thought, truly. Do other people have a grasp on this, the significance and also comprehensibility to younger people of this poetry now? I'm really interested too to hear more about Philip's daughter's attraction to this material.
She was
but anyone can
into it, Kevin.
What's that? You just like strong-armed her into doing this?
I was like, hey, she's a writer. I think one of the things that I remember when I was in Russia in the early 90s and the empire was sort of falling apart, that, I was just remarking on it to a friend. He goes, oh, you'll understand someday. And in a sense, maybe we're living a kind of similar moment as the Moscow Conceptualist moment, which is a sort of unwinding of a certain kind of American power and a sort of an evacuation of the idea of any kind of moral leadership in the world. So the younger generation may feel a kind of similar sense of the idiocy of power and the sort of falseness of the world that's been ideologically constructed for them. So I would say that. And the second thing I would say is the absurdism of the Moscow Conceptualists is so deeply playful, and it's very analog as well. And there's something about the idea of play and presence, which is deeply appealing in a digital and alienating age.
Other responses from the other translators and scholars here?
Well, I can't speak to how young people, I don't teach, so I don't know how younger people would approach this stuff. But for me, one of the reasons that it is attractive, and I think it is attractive to a broad range of people, is because you can see what he's doing, whether it's Rubinstein or Monastyrski or Prigov, and they appear to be having fun doing it. And that's communicated pretty clearly that I mean, shall we go farther? Can you top this? And I think that the pleasure that one would get in reading these things and seeing the clockwork, seeing how it's put together, or what is the idea that they've used to germinate each step that follows it, I think for someone who has it, I mean, they have to have the prior interest in literature or in art. But if they have that, then I think that this kind of writing is extremely appealing to anybody. But I would think to someone who's just beginning to be exposed to this kind of material.
Yelena, Ryan?
Yeah. The one thing that I wanted to mention is, I mean, it's maybe paradoxical. So for Monastyrski in particular, this question of the referential circle, right? The immediate audience within Moscow who would be listening to or flipping through these books, who are in the know, who are, knowing listeners. I mean, in a way, although, we live in a completely different connected society, the people who are watching us right now, we're like this Zoom life that we're all kind of going through. I mean, things can be targeted very specifically to audiences that are interested. And I mean, even this question of like Zoom fatigue, this question of attention and fatigue, this is something that Monastyrski is playing with, very consciously. And, I think maybe Rubinstein also, and Prigov, but Monastyrski is very specifically, at different moments in the poetry and in the performances, is aware that he's exhausting you. And then, he continues, and then he switches gears. But I think he's really interested in this question of kind of audiences and who's listening. And I think, we can attend to that in the present moment also.
Yet for all of the, I mean, I totally agree with, and I love all of these comments. Some of them are completely new to me and they ring completely true. I think in some sense, this question also takes us back to one of Matvei's observations at the beginning of our presentations here today about the specificity of Moscow conceptualist work, and the distinctions between Moscow conceptualism and Western conceptualisms of the same period that were so oriented on irony and a kind of an all-encompassing ironization. I think there's something about these texts, and not to get too autobiographical about this either, I heard these texts performed in the early 90s as well in Moscow, and I interpreted them through my own, Western sensibility as being texts which are simply conceptualist and ironic, deeply invested in their position of, critical deconstruction of ideological meanings of all kinds, the deflation of all kinds of language to analyzable, critiquable discourse. And for me, somehow now, and maybe this goes to Philip's comment, you'll understand someday. I somehow have access suddenly in the past like 5 or 6 years to the kind of existentialist seriousness of these poems and the sincerity of so many of these poems. They are deeply emotional, straight poems. That Rubinstein poem, despite the fact that it ends with all of these weird frames that in 20 years ago I would have interpreted as, okay, we've had all this like straight talk and now we're going to deflate it with all these frames that are going to, set it at a distance from us. Despite all the frames, I feel like all the stuff in the middle is heartfelt and sincere and deep. So I don't know, I'm thinking that there's something actually about this poetry which speaks to a moment now of people trying to get past a certain kind of an all-encompassing postmodernist, critical relationship to language, ideology, et cetera, that was characteristic of the West in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and towards something else that was already apparent to these poets in the 1960s and 70s and 80s when they were writing. I don't know if that's right or not. Maybe I'm just like a crazy, idealist. I've been watching too much Tarkovsky or something. Does anyone have an idea about that? Am I just totally wrong and off the wall here?
I remember actually asking Prigov, is this like ironia? He goes, this is not irony. I'm not interested in distance. I'm interested in absolute connection. And so, yeah, I mean, that's surprised me. And I feel the same way about Rubinstein. I do. I mean, I think what attracts me to him is that he's able to have his postmodern cake and eat it as well. That there is some real absolute seriousness to the text. They're not simply absurdist play. They're concerned with existence, you know? And I think in that way, they're, you know, recognizably deeply Russian in that sense. Even though they're couched and they're angular and they push you away in certain ways at the same time. So
other people have takes on that, sincerity versus irony?
I think that there are several works of Prigov's where he talks about taking away. If you take this away, you take this away, you take this away. And I think that the irony and so on, these are tools. And then when you've taken all these other things away, which you do in some cases by exposing the machinery behind them, you are left with sincerity. I mean, when Prigov writes a poem about how he feels about doing the dishes, he sat down, put himself in the framework of a high romantic poet, and how would a high romantic poet approach the fact that you have to do the dishes?
Yes. Other responses to that one? I saw Brian, he had an idea that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you can tell from the first poems that Simon read that in a way, Prigov and the other Moscow conceptualists were laughing at the worship of great literature and the kind of the nostalgia for some kind of belonging to a greater sense of Western culture and this idea of the classics. But at the same time, I think they were really invested in being a part of, you know, contemporary international culture and continuing it through a kind of avant-garde experimentation. And so in that sense, there was that kind of seriousness and sincerity to their project. I think Monastyrski in particular was really interested in like John Cage and Stockhausen and contemporary music and Fluxus. And so he was, you know, I mean, his work doesn't read as like obviously ironic as Prigov or Rubinstein's, but that's the kind of tradition he was interested in, and he was really serious about making work in that vein.
Yeah, I would say also we can't forget about this technique of shimmering that, you know, Daniel Lederman has talked about. And, you know, for Monastyrski in particular, I mean, he doesn't want to bombard you with, you know, the shock, right? He always talks about the comfortable sort of, you enter into the poem or into the action in this comfortable way that you don't even know that it's starting, and then you're in it, and then, you know, is it irony, is it sincerity? Like, you know, I mean, what's the distinction? He's sort of, I think, you know, you're always looking in the wrong direction with him. So I think maybe the terms are they don't fit him very well, but you know, maybe both. But this idea of kind of comfortable immersion in the text is what he's going for.
So I'm so glad that we have art historians here, by the way, because one of the sort of strange fates that I wanted to ask you all about tonight is not just the question of the relevance of Moscow conceptualism here in the United States for us, now that it's become available to us through all of your amazing work as translators and editors, Matvei. But there's also the question of the resonance of Moscow conceptualist work in Russia. I'm interested in particular in the distinction between what has happened for conceptualist visual art and conceptualist poetry, which points to a kind of a strange, perhaps unforeseen at the time, distinction between these two media in the world, that in some sense, poetry is never something that makes a lot of money. And the status of this poetry as outsider poetry is something which perhaps can never be challenged. It's poetry which is not for the masses, especially not in Russia where people like rhyme and so on, even now that we have, you know, non-rhyming poets in Russia. Whereas visual art in the hyper-capitalist world of the post-socialist century is worth money. And conceptualist visual art, which was created for these very small circles, for intimate gatherings, for oneself, has suddenly turned out to be archives which are worth the investment by oligarchs into acquisition, by the Hermitage, which has special rooms. Prigov is an interesting case in that he's like halfway between the two worlds. And there is actually a Prigov room at the Hermitage now. But I'm interested in your reflections on what this poetry means in Russia, in contemporary Russia, in relationship both to its poetic character, but also in comparison to this other case, the case of Moscow Conceptualist visual art. The art historians have to answer.
Well, I mean, my first thought is that, you know, when I was living in Moscow in the early 2000s, that was a period when a lot of Moscow conceptualists were getting their first big museum shows in Russia, like Eric Bulatov. This was when Collective Actions, the group that Monastyrski founded, was also being exhibited. And I think that the fact that he showed in exhibitions and like developed a market around his work was what led to the publication of his poetry, because Yelena, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think any of his poetry was actually published until like 2007. And then, you know, that led to greater recognition. So it just was, you know, the creation of an art market, attention to visual art that sort of helped Moscow Conceptualism get canonized as a major movement. And I think the interest in the literature sort of has gone along with that and followed it to some extent.
I think it's important to remember that many of the figures of the Moscow Conceptualist kind of circle stuck around and were around, and you would see them. I mean, they are around, many of them are still alive, although not all. You know, aside from, you know, the 60s generation, the Kabakov and Bulatov and Pivovarov, you know, a lot of them stuck around. Monastyrski stuck around, and you would see them at openings, and they are, you know, intensely interested in younger artists and in what's happening. And I think that's important. And I think, you know, Monastyrski is a kind of, you know, Grace called him a guru. You know, that kind of attention to artists coming up and the expanding of that that circle of interlocutors is really important. And that's kind of what kept, I mean, aside from the art market and the museums and all of this, to continue to expand the referential circle and to include younger generations, you know, they were doing that in the 80s and they continued. So, I mean, I think that should be, you know, accounted.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So there are a few questions that have accumulated in the chat, which have come in from the YouTube, which I feel that we should pose here. There are also Monastyrski questions. So one of them is just a question about the development of Monastyrski's career, to hear a little bit more about how he progressed. Another is regarding the drawings of Monastyrski and their resemblance to technical drawings, electronic circuits, and is there a connection with circuitry drawing there? So I'm wondering if you could address those questions as well while we have you on the screen.
Do you want to talk about his career, Brian, or you want me to do it?
Yeah, well, I think career is a really funny word to use with Monastyrski, but I mean, that's just what we usually say in English for like the whole of someone's output. But you know, he was just sort of doing his little thing in his apartment for decades, and the career part has only happened in the last like 20 years. But yeah, I mean, I think he, you know, he is a little bit unusual among the Moscow Conceptualists in that he didn't really study to be an artist. He studied literature, was interested in poetry, and was very interested in contemporary music. Like I mentioned, he was interested in John Cage, and so I think he was more interested in experimental poetry in the early 70s. He spent a lot of time with Elizaveta Zakhanova, who made these visual books, these artist books, and who was also very interested in music. And so, one of the diagrams in elementary poetry that we read is dedicated to her. And I think that she exerted a big influence on his attention to the book. And someone I think also brought up like the relationship between his poetry and the collective actions. And the first one, I mean, at the beginning, they were kind of conceived as a new kind of poetry reading. Like they weren't really thought of as performances. They were thought of as readings and sort of bringing people out to the woods and to experience something. There wasn't actually any poetry read, but he was interested in that form of the gathering that the reading also shares. And so, but as it went on, he got more involved in conceptualist works or visual art, got more interested in things like performance and the creation of meaning through the event. It kind of veered away from poetry a little bit. So, and Yelena can fill in the gaps and tell you more about the drawings and how they are related to electric circuits. Or not related to electric circuits.
Yeah, I mean, so it's important to remember that Monastyrski works as a kind of a methodologue, so like a kind of functionary, like a type of curator maybe at a literature museum, one of these kind of small city museums. And so he's kind of curating little shows of literary figures. He's interested in all kinds of diagrams, charts, even from school days. He is copying out pages of the great Soviet encyclopedia and star charts and lists of animal typologies and all kinds of things. So the electric circuit board is, I think, just another kind of form that he's filling with other things. What's important about this one in particular, and I think it's highlighted through the painting, is that he's putting, I mean, the diagrams in this work, these dreams, they demonstrate the kind of the relationality of signs. So a thing, the river Strela arrow is also an arrow, or, the egg and the, can be an egg, or it can be a circle, or it can be other things that, and you can see that in the painting, because the painting, manages to try to create three-dimensionality and adds other kinds of semantic, semiotic valences. So he's doing a lot with not a lot with that diagram.
I was also going to add, I think Monastyrski mentions in his memoirs that he went to Kabakov's studio in 1971 and saw Answers of the Experimental Group, which is a grid with text written in the boxes, various utterances from people. And that was when he sort of realized that the diagram could be a form for experimental artwork. And that kind of brought back his childhood interest in the diagram. And then that was, part of this very productive period of him making drawings and books.
That's fascinating. I didn't know about the Kabakov connection there at the start. We have to be moving towards a close, but I wanted to ask a question which I know is always interesting to audiences who hear poetry in translation, and that's about translation. And I'll try and pose it a little more. Usually you get the question, what was hard to translate about this poetry? But I'll rephrase it a little bit. What is lost in translation here? What are we missing by hearing this in English that you can add to our picture in order to fill it out more? So I don't know who wants to take that first. Maybe Philip or Simon.
Allusions, that this sort of thick referentiality, in one Rubinstein text begins Mama Mila Ramu, which means Mama was washing the window frame. But that was a typical first line in an azbuka, like an alphabet book. And so kids would be practicing their letters. And so instantly there would be a kind of nostalgic shot of energy that a listener would have had for that. And so the kind of the deep textual elusive contexts of these moments, I think is something that's lost.
Simon?
Yeah, I think I would completely agree with that, you know, when you're translating it, at least if you're me, that there is an original, or there is a childhood song, or there's a image in a movie or something of that sort, that and you know what the function is, and to a certain extent you can mentally say, okay, well, that would be a scene from Casablanca, something of that sort, but lacking that sort of immersion in, and also in the high culture as well. I mean, do I know that this is a line of Lermontov that's being parodied or something like that? That you can figure out. It's a little easier than some of the other stuff, but you always know it doesn't resonate with you. The image would resonate with the childhood, say, of the person from the Soviet background, and you can't cause it to resonate with the American background without doing violence to what's in it. And so that is the most difficult part. I mean, there are other writers who are just linguistically very complicated, but I found Prigov and the Rubinstein that I've read in Russian, it's not too difficult for someone like me.
And I'll throw in here, you know, Ainsley's comment here, in addition to yours, that it's meta references, because it's not just the initial reference, but it's also a reference to the kind of claustrophobic, self-sufficient quality of Soviet culture, the way everyone was continuously citing and mentioning these commonly known texts. And it's hard to recreate that as well, obviously, in our much more non-homogeneous and disparate culture. Yelena, Brian, do you have things to add to the question about translatability and loss in translation?
I don't think a whole lot is lost in elementary poetry #1. You know, these texts, or this one in particular, like there's not that sort of dense network. It's very kind of anti-literary almost. Would you agree with that, Yelena?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think, you know, there's a lot added, and I think that's a very Monastyrskian quality.
Nothing is lost, all will be saved.
Well, he allows others to sort of glom onto and add on to. He's not, you know, super controlling about, I mean, he's controlling about certain things, but he's ultimately not super controlling about the outcome. So I think I would say this is an interpretation of the original in a way that just adds things. One thing that was hard was the sonority, the sounds, because it's hard to translate, you know, those particular kinds of onomatopoeia, and we tried hard, and
because it's also like, it's not direct onomatopoeia. I think
there's a question.
At one point suggested, like, you know, I think there's like a chuk churuk, and Matvei was like, well, that chuk is kind of like knock, so why don't you do knock? But my feeling was that it, you know, it wasn't right to go that literal, because it was more about the transformations of the sounds and the syllables, and making a little bit more abstract and not connected to actual words was a better way to go. And Zilly,
Zilly, yes.
He's sort of playing with z and tsa, the Russian letter tsa, and then the hard N and the soft N at the end of the words, which we kind of rendered as like ing, ink, and in, to sort of approximate the variations that he was.
Yeah, the variations are programmatic, so they're not kind of random. He kind of changes them in particular ways, and so we sort of followed the pattern, which created not exactly onomatopoeia, but, you know, some other thing. But there's even reference in there that Tsing, I mean, he's talking about the I Ching a little bit, but not completely. So that was very hard.
That's fascinating. Programmatic, but not onomatopoeic. I'm gonna have to think about that for a while.
Yeah, another thing I just remembered is that, you know, I think it's Tsilibrin, but instead of doing that, I wanted to do like cling or clink, because zin zin is what Russians say when they're like clinking glasses.
Yeah, very important Russian noises.
Yeah.
All right, I think we are at a, the clink clink is actually, it's a reminder to us that for some time zones, this is a perfect time for a cocktail. And for others, of course, it's always time for a cocktail. I want to thank all of the participants. A final very short question to Matvei. Are there more conceptualist texts in the works?
Sorry. Yeah, I would like to say so, but these were some complicated books. Elementary Poetry was a very complicated book. There's a lot of really incredible just materiality to deal with and visual aspects. And the Prigov book is a bit more straightforward. It came out just after Elementary Poetry. I've been thinking and talking to some people about doing Prigov's kind of more sound-oriented and visually oriented poetry to complement the Soviet textbook, which we have to take some time for that. And there's a number of translators that have worked on those parts of his work, but many things haven't been translated that are more like book works or artist book-like in a way, maybe a little closer to concrete poetry and so forth. So it would be a very different type of book. We also have done the Nekrasov book with Ainsley and Bella, and that is quite a tome of minimalists, sort of near conceptualists. And Nekrasov was also part of the Monastyrski circle and activities of collective actions. And I think, I hopefully will get to expand on in this vein of Lianozova as well, and the group of sort of nearby Moscow Conceptualists, other groups of kind of like the non-official writing scenes in the Soviet Union. But time permitting, we'll do more. And I think there's a lot more of Monastyrski also. I don't know if Yelena and Brian have it in them to do more, but there's a ton more, and I hope other presses and other translators also take on some of this work. I do believe that Lev Rubinstein has found that some of the works that were included in the so-called complete catalog of his work, which came out several years ago, and which, Philip's translation covers everything that Lev Rubinstein thought was there, but then he remembered some other texts, or some scholars pointed out some other texts that hadn't been included. So we might have to do like a revised, expanded, complete catalog of comedic novelties at some point.
The completer. The completer catalog.
Ever more complete catalog. So yeah, I mean, and also those works would be really we did one edition of one of them as index cards, one of the texts, but it would be great to see more of them in their physical kind of manifestations. Who knows? We'll see. But thank you so much for having all of us here at Kelly Writer's House.
So glad to have you. And, so much looking forward to all of us somehow gathering with the next publications of Moscow Conceptualism at Kelly Writer's House, physically and in person. But this was pretty great too. Thank you all for joining. Thank you to everyone who joined in from YouTube. I see that we still have an audience there. So it was wonderful to have all of your questions, and it was a great conversation. I love this work so much. I think it's really important. So thank you for sharing it with us. And with the participants, just stick around for a couple of minutes after we close down the public channel for some administrative chit chat. Thank you, everyone. I think that's it for the night.